So the Ruggles Lecture is a very important tradition of the IARIW Society, and we certainly have a very prestigious speaker today. We'd like to start this session by awarding the Ruggles Prize. So I'm going to ask Shitakshi Dongji, who's on the IARIW Council, to come up and announce this year's winner. So Shitakshi, please.
Good evening, everyone. Going to tell you a bit about the Ruggles Prize, and then we'll announce the winner for this prize this year. The Ruggles Prize is sponsored by the Nancy and Richard Ruggles Memorial. The aim of the prize is to promote the development of young researchers by recognizing their outstanding scholarship. Researchers aged 35 or under and who have a paper selected for presentation at the General Conference of the Association are eligible to receive this prize. The award money is $2,500 US. And this year I had the pleasure to serve on the awards committee alongside my colleague, Tom Crosby. We received 7 excellent submissions this year and had a daunting task of selecting one winner out of all those. These submissions were exceptionally good, and we had a really hard time to figure out who should be the winner. I would like to give kudos and make an honorable mention to the paper by Lepinture, Mentab, and Walt, which was also a close runner-up. And now to this year's prize-winning paper for the Ruggles Prize. The prize goes to Daniel Ripperger-Suhler of the US Bureau of Economic Analysis for his paper, Consumer Learning and Outlet Substitution Bias, How Diffusion of Product Quality Knowledge Impacts Measures of Price Change. It's a long title. In this paper, Daniel develops an approach to take into account unobserved quality of goods and services as it evolves over time. He applies his models to examine the New York City market for taxis and ride-share services and finds that unobserved quality terms estimated in the consumer learning model are important predictors of price. Please join me in congratulating Daniel. Catherine, maybe I should go then. He wants a picture. Yeah, okay.
Okay, now it's my great pleasure to introduce our Ruggles Prize lecturer for this year. So I think many of you probably know Stephen Jenkins extremely well. He's been around this association for a very, very long time. Sorry, Stephen. I've also been around this association for a very long time. Oh boy, that was bad. Okay, I'm off to a good start. Okay, so Stephen has kindly accepted to be our Ruggles lecturer for this year. Stephen has a PhD from the University of York, and he's a professor of economic and social policy in the Department of Social Policy at the London School of Economics. Stephen's research interests span labor and public economics, inequality and poverty, applied econometrics, and quantitative methods. His work includes analysis of the income distribution, income mobility and poverty dynamics, income volatility, and measurement errors in survey and administrative data. I will not attempt to summarize his very long and impressive publication record, which is to say that he is widely published in a broad range of academic journals and has authored many books. Stephen has served both as president of this prestigious organization in the mid-2000s and more recently as president of the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality, or ECONEC, and he's the only person who's ever served as president of both of these organizations. He's also recently served as a member of the panel on an integrated system of U.S. household income, wealth, and consumption Data and Statistics to Inform Policy and Research, which was established by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on National Statistics. He is here today to explore the question, what do we know about income volatility? So the floor is yours, Stephen.
I'm rather nervous, or I suppose an old guy might be, you know. Thank you, Catherine. It's an honor and a privilege to speak at an association. It's true, I've been coming to these conferences for about 4 decades, so it's quite a long time. I want to start with some homage and acknowledgements, in particular to Nancy and Richard Ruggles, who clearly, those of you who don't know, played a really foundational role in the association. I was lucky to meet them, I think, only about once, and I think that was Lahnstein Conference in 1985, and I think Tim Smeeding introduced me to them. I really can't remember, it's a long time, but huge legacies set up by the Ruggles, not just in terms of their memorial fund, and you see these nice prizes, but, you know, there are families, you know, the descendants of Ruggles, both families and others, and, you know, Patricia, who's come to these conferences for many years. Patricia, I learned a lot from her about poverty dynamics, and her brother Stephen, well, if you do data, you know about IPOOMs. I'm going to talk about data, nothing to do with IPOOMs, but there's a Ruggles influence. And so the generational connections go on. Ed Wolf used to room in the Ruggles basement and learned about those things. Lars Osberg was also supervised by the Ruggles. And that leads us through Ed, who was the doctoral supervisor of Conchita, and leads us on to Conchita and Prasada Rao and the review again. And they've, you know, just done a wonderful term serving as editors of the review. And of course, partly one of the big reasons I'm nervous is because of all the previous Ruggles lecturers before me. And I've just listed a few who are more in my area rather than others, and particularly salute Tony Atkinson, who's had a huge influence on my career, but all the others have as well. There are important other acknowledgements that I have to bow. Some of the work I'm going to be talking about later on is part financed by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the 2 people named are the managers of our project. Even more importantly are my co-authors on this project work that I shall be talking about later. Mike Brewer, who's here in the front row, and Nye Comenetti, who's not here, very important. And finally, important data acknowledgements. Some of the work I'm going to talk about later on is through Secure Research Service of the Office for National Statistics. And behind that are the people whose project we piggybacked on, the so-called WED project, based at the University of Western England. And they've done a lot of important work in terms of creating the data I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to show you in terms of that work later on, the numbers are preliminary. We're going to be revising the data later on. And I should also say that I'm going to be talking about rich countries only. So down to business. What do we know about income volatility? I'm going to try and answer the question. If you haven't got time, this is essentially the talk on a slide. And I shall be working through this for the rest of the lecture. So the first point I'm going to make is that there is actually little up-to-date information about volatility in household income. This is particularly, you know, household income volatility is particularly important because we should discuss it a bit later on, because those studies can also talk about the volatility of the components making up household income packages. By contrast with household income volatility, there's a lot more up-to-date information about volatility in employment earnings, and particularly about the US, and we'll see that there is a lot more about administrative record data. Third point, and where we're heading at the end of the talk, is that I'm going to argue that there's not enough information about what goes on within years. I'll explain a bit more about that. And then the king hit at the end is just to rub home this point about volatility within years. I'm going to show you that there's a huge amount of it, at least in the UK, and that's really important, not least because of interactions with cash transfer systems. So the sort of headline point is going to be about the importance of aligning people's income reference periods across their life domains. But you might have been saying, what the heck is income volatility in the first place? So we're talking about changes over time. So it's a longer, talking about the movies of people's lives, but it's not about income mobility. Well, in general it is, but it's in particular about the fluctuations, the ups and the downs, or as this quotation from the Aspen Institute says, about divergence from the average, and we've been talking about that. And we're going to be talking about issues about how long that period should be. And we're interested in volatility basically because it's related to income risk. I'll come back at the end to just say whether or not it's actually picking out income risk. But usual thing, income risk is a bad thing for risk-averse individuals. And that's the essential argument. And we should also probably think, it's pretty easy to think, that the effect of that volatility is going to be greater for the people at the bottom. So we keep that in mind, and I'll provide some information about the extent to which it's at the bottom, particularly at the end. There are lots of constituencies out there that are interested in this research or should be interested in this topic. I've listed at least 4 of them, starting at the top, which are people who are interested in social and public policy, to include non-economists, believe it or not. And the thing here is that pointing to that a lot of the interest is to do with how families and households and the individuals within them are faring. So family fortunes, if you will. And therefore, the interest is in household income because it's a more comprehensive measure of overall living standards and economic well-being. A second constituency is what I call labor microeconomists, with North Americans, of course, without the U. So in here, earnings volatility is just another feature of the labor market that is looked at along with other, like pay levels and things like that, and inequality. And of course, the emphasis here is on earnings, forgetting about the other income sources. There's also a sort of sub-area which I might call labor macroeconomists, where they're very macroeconomists, interested about consumption behavior, how, well, as it says in the quote there from Ganong, about the sensitivity of consumption to transitory shocks. This literature is a bit confused. In a sense, the motivations are about households and their reactions, but if you look at the empirical work, most of it's about individual earnings. And I'll show you an example of that later on. And then there's income distribution people who will do anything with distributions, in particular looking at income and earnings. And I guess I would classify myself as number 1, 2, and 4. So I've got widespread interests in this topic. And of course, it's also of interest to society as a whole, and I've pulled out 2 popular books, North American ones by Peter Gosselin and Jacob Hacker's one. Interestingly, there aren't so many of these books around now, and I've got one remark about that later on, but the point is that volatility is of widespread interest, I would say. What I'm not going to talk about is income mobility in general. As people like Gary Fields and I have argued, mobility's got multiple facets, and volatility is just one of them. It's also not a lot the same as economic insecurity. There are quite a few papers at this conference about that. It's a broader topic than volatility. I'm not talking about composite indices of economic insecurity. I'm talking rather narrowly about describing fluctuations in income and earnings. So how in these literatures is volatility measured? First distinction we have to make is between measures that are based on 2 periods, what I'm calling period pair measures, that start for each person, looking at the changes in income or earnings between some period, the last period, and the current period. And that, in most cases, has been annual income between last year and this year. And that's true for most US databases. Also EU Silk, it's got annual household income the previous year. Alternatively, move across to the UK. Most UK surveys have a measure of current income or monthly income. And the standard practice has been to look at volatility in the sense of changes in income between two current income observations approximately a year apart. And that's true for all the analyses based on UK household surveys, British Household Panel Survey and its successor, Understanding Society, Labour Force Survey, where you've got earnings at the first and last quarter interviews, and also the UK Survey of Employees, the so-called Annual Survey of Hours and Employment, ASH. Or you could have changes in monthly income between 2 consecutive months, and that's very rare. Wait till the second half. There are also multi-period measures, but I'll come back to those shortly. So how do we identify changes at the individual level? Short answer, this literature looks at proportionate changes, but they're proportionate changes that you may not be familiar with. Namely, we work in terms of ARC percentage changes, with the definition given on the left-hand side. It's just like an ordinary old percentage, except in the denominator, you don't have the last period's value, you have the average of the current and last period's value. And that's got some really nice properties. Basically, the ARC percentage change is symmetric and rises and falls, and the little table on the right-hand side gives examples of that. You can see the various pairs that I put together, for example, going from 50 to 100 or 100 down to 50. You can see that registers changes of plus and minus 2/3, whereas the percentage change is asymmetric. The ARC percentage change is also bounded above by minus 200 and plus 200, which is what happens when you go from a 0 to a positive or the other way around. So essentially, in our context, when you go from 0 income to some income, or if you're in the labour market, we are effectively including the zeros, the zero earners. So going in gives you an ARC percentage change of 200%. You go out from something to a 0, that's minus 200. So the literature also distinguishes between that, which is labour market volatility, and earnings volatility, which is when you're focusing only on people who've got positive values last period and this period. Okay, so you've got those measures for each individual. Now you have to aggregate them. How do you do it? And I put up four examples on the slide there. The first one is probably the most popular. It's the standard deviation of the ARC percentage changes. The variance is also used, obviously closely related. It's the second moment of the change distribution. When I came into this, I thought, what are they looking at the second moment for? And also, it's cross-sectional rather than longitudinal. So I'll come back to that. There's also standard deviation of changes in log income, which is a fairly obvious way of going about it. But of course, it's restricted, because you're taking logs, to having positive values in both time periods. There are variants on that. And then number 3, which is I'm going to base most of my slides on, is the mean of the absolute value of the ARC percentage changes, which is the first moment of the change distribution, and also has a nice link with number 4. But number 3 is quite nice because it's the expected value, and it's also the weighted average of the increases and decreases, where the weights are the proportions of people with increases and decreases. And the number 4 is, of course, what some people have looked at quite a lot, is the proportion of people who are experiencing large changes, where those changes can be pluses, of course, or minuses, rises or falls. So you're focusing on the tails of the distribution. Well, you might say, does it matter which of those measures you use? And the short answer is that it doesn't. It's not very well known, but if you've essentially, all those 3 measures will actually provide very similar measures of trends over time, even though they look rather different. And that's partly because of the properties of the changes over short time, essentially being centered around 0 and a few other things, But basically, the only difference between those measures is that they're using different distance functions. And for you distance function junkies, they're all versions of Minkowski distance, L1 norms, L2 norms, or Manhattan distance and Euclidean distance. But the short answer is they're going to provide much the same answers. And I shall give you an example of that. There are multi-period measures based on a sequence of incomes. Non-parametric ones, where you just look at the variance, for example, around each individual's longitudinally averaged income, averaged across individuals. A really important difference, however, is all the standard economists do their averaging over log income, whereas others do it over income. And that makes a bit of a difference. So essentially, Moffat and Gottschalk is always based on log income, others are not. Or you can go heavy-duty econometrics, the model-based ones, which is where you look at model log earnings processes over time, where you break things down into transitory and permanent components. So, for example, Moffat and Gottschalk and lots of other sorts of people. So I now want to look at household income volatility. I'm going to race you through a range of studies to illustrate country case studies, cross-national comparisons, the fact that there are different ways of treating the data, coverage, not very recent, types of data used, and whether or not people look at income volatility and relate it to components. First, start with the fact that the US is different. So as you know, the empirical world started in around 1970 with the PSID, and Moffat and Gottschalk did a lot of work on this sort of thing. And so here's an example of using the transitory variance of log income, and you can see basically there's a substantial rise over time there. I did some work for the UK, only from 1994, so the red line over there corresponds to the left-hand period. But you can see from the chart, whereas the US is continuing to go up, basically it's always been flat over this period in the UK. Just to rub it home that the US is different, this is from Nichols and Rame work, using a slightly different measure, their transitory variance type measure, this V. And you can see for the Britain, Canada, and Germany, basically things are flat. This is, again, period overlapping with what I showed you for me, but US going up. But note the series finish before 2010. If we look at probability of experience and large income fall, and we again go to the US, and the trend upwards, this is work from Hacker and Jacobs this time, again PSID based, going back to 1970-ish. You can see that there's a rise up to so this is, but again, 2004-05, a rise over time. This is a prevalence of a 50% or greater drop in family income. So it's huge, it's huge. Go from up 4% to more than doubling with a bit of wobbling around the end. Look at the UK on the right-hand side, the bottom series, 3% and pretty much constant. Okay. Here's another example from Jacob Hacker, a more recent work for an OECD volume, where it's clearly cross-country. And on the vertical axis, this is the proportion experiencing a 25% or greater loss in household size adjusted income from one year to the next. He's got a period of data, so that's why there's a range. I won't talk about the bar. Let's concentrate on the diamonds in there. But you could line up, and there's a huge range going from around 5%, which is the standard Nordic countries, moving up Germany, France, Britain, and Australia around about the middle there. US is even higher, but there are even some competitors with the US up there, and you can see right at the very end is Serbia. And so there's a huge range between the 0.25-ish area and 0.05 in terms of these proportions. Dramatic. And then most recently from the OECD, they've got a very interesting big study called On Shaky Ground, which is all about income instability. The important thing in this graph is to look at the vertical axis, I would say. They're looking at 48 months of income, so it looks promising. They've got month-by-month incomes. And you can see there are dramatic differences. In particular, Britain doesn't come out particularly well in the sense of the high level at the top there. And there's a big cluster around 0.1 in terms of this variation. But I would draw your attention to the fact that these are synthetic monthly incomes. So you might wonder, you know, if we're looking at fluctuations over time, but they're in fact having to create their data. So it's very innovative, but it would be nice to have monthly income. Examples of breaking things down into income components, and I like these studies because it's making them the most of what you've got from household income packages, and being able to relate them to each other. And I've split the studies into examples from over time from one country, and then there's a few at the bottom, just two that are doing cross-national comparisons. You see the list. I want to focus on two of them. The first one is Karen Dinan, Elmendorf, and Sickle, because this is an early study of how to do this with the US. It was PSID data. So the volatility is summarized with the standard deviation about percentage changes, and then they've smoothed the changes. The zeros are in there. And then they take us through different parts of the household income package. So we've got heads earnings, and you can see over time, as you might expect from the previous slides, about volatility going up over time in the US. If you add in spouses' earnings, you've got a decline, but then you put them together, the pooled earnings, and the picture is much flatter. Okay, so people are putting their packages together in a way to reduce risk. The far right-hand side is about non-labor income, and you can see that's fairly flat but rising. But then if you put it all together, you get down to the standard deviation of percentage changes at the bottom, which is rising, and not as sharply as the earnings one, or translated into the probabilities of large declines on the right-hand side. So that's, you know, obviously there's much more in their paper, but you get the idea of what to do. Another example, this is by Mike Brewer and his colleagues from Essex, is another more recent study of contributions to income volatility, building on the formulae from Bradley Hardley and Ziliak. So the idea here is we start at the top on the left-hand side, and you can see that's individual gross labor income. But then as you add in combined head and spouse's earnings, we move down basically to the two lines at the bottom, in particular the market income. You can see volatility drops a lot. Okay, but then we take that dotted line up to the top right-hand side there, and as you go down from market to disposable income, so you take into account cash transfers and taxes, it reduces volatility substantially. So what explains then the trajectory over time? Well, answer, what you can do is break down the volatility in the total into the volatility of each of the different components related to variances, V's. You can look at changes in the correlations between the components, head and spouse's earnings, the extent to which they're moving together, and of course the importance of each of the shares of the components in the total. So I'm not going to get you to eyeball the table, just to know that these tables are there. You can do this stuff and tell a story about what's happened over time. And the quotation at the top is Mike and colleagues' story about what happened over time. Namely, it's rather complicated because there's so much going on. But essentially, there was, as they point out, there are two conflicting trends and that are leading to explain this very shallow U-shape that you see there. So what we've seen is that these papers are informative about the role of different income components and provide a broad brush analysis. Not really up to date, and I speculate, perhaps because volatility in the US is no longer rising in the way it was before. Surveys, potentially small sizes, potential measurement error, and the reference period issues that I've been talking about before. There are important sources of data that economists don't use a lot, small scale but detailed studies of family finances. And one of my messages is that these sorts of studies are important complements and should be used more. Two big examples, two Johns. John Hills from the LSE, Chatting Income a long time ago, and also later Jonathan Murdoch and colleagues' Financial Diaries project, which is about it. But there have also been other studies in the UK that do that more recently, and I'm sure there are others in the US as well. So that's income volatility. What about pay volatility? We can go through almost the same story for the US, for example, of the role of the US, and this is back to Moffat and Gottschalk again. You can see this is now a log of male earnings, so it's men, transitory variance, and you can see over the period a rise, but then flattening out and perhaps a rise again at the end. Compare it with the US. If you go to the UK, comparable period, flat. Okay, US is different. But on the what happens if you change your data set? So another couple of leading papers in this literature, one by Shin and Solon, and again you can see by the date when it's going up to. If you follow on the left-hand side the purple dots, that's their series of rise, 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 and then in the beginning of the 80s decline, sort of U-shaped and rise again. So that's PSID, and that's roughly the same trend as Moffat and Gottschalk. But then if you go to Sable, House and Song, using these wonderful administrative record data, you get the trends on the right-hand side. Clearly, the arrowed bit at the end, the end of the period, they've got rather different views about what's happening on there. So data sets, the type of data may matter. And there is also some interesting stuff that I could talk about later about whether or not you think going the parametric approach is useful in this context or not. Let's go back to the UK. Why? We can bring women in, at last. Okay, on the left-hand side, so we have, this is from British Household Panel Survey. We have this is standard deviation of arc percentage changes, men at the top, women at the bottom, and there's two pairs of lines. The solid lines is what I'm calling earnings volatility. So remember, this is just people who are in the labor market, positive earnings in 2 consecutive periods. The gray lines above them refer to, including the zeros. So this is people moving from 0 to something or the other way around. Labor market volatility. And you can see, consistent with what we've seen before, and for both men and women, Britain, it's flat, and decline in labor market volatility. We also did a transatlantic comparison with following Ziliak, Hardy, and Bollinger, and so convert to their metric, so square the standard deviation, you get the variance, and you get the British pictures, which are the dark lines, flat, decline. You can see that in the US, the lines are higher, which we might have expected, but in fact, labor market volatility is not declining in the same sort of way. So there are differences across countries. Well, I've said data sources might make a difference. So interestingly, Robert Moffat organized a big, and others organized a big comparison of different data sets to look at the same question about volatility as measured by the standard or variance of arc percentage changes over time from data sets, 3 survey ones, PSID, SIP, CPS, ASIC earnings measures, and 2 administrative ones. And this is what you get going back to the beginning of the 70s through to mid-2010s. And I ask you, do they show the same results? Well, I guess it depends on how you look at it, right? Certainly the PSID line, the big black one, big long one, if you were to take that out, then the things are more similar. But Robert and the others basically argue that they're, broadly speaking, telling the same story. But I think you can discuss about that. There are other particular American features out there which you don't see in the UK, which is about these recession-related peaks and so on. More recent CPS DER data have looked at this again, and they have, so this is Richard Blundell and also the Kentucky people again, exploiting the administrative record data that are linked into CPS observations for a long period going back to 80 through to 2020, broken down for men and for women, and for whites and blacks, so the whites are in blue, the blacks are in red, and there's a distinction between those who've got some college education or less, which are the solid lines, and the dotted lines are those with college education or more. And again, it's labor market volatility, earnings volatility, and you can see that there's been quite some changes over time. Greatest changes for women, but consistent with what I was showing you for the US on the previous slide, it's relatively flat in the middle with some declines at the end, so it can make a difference. I haven't got time to go through their model-based estimates, but they sort of tell the same story. I do want to tell you about GRID, however, which is about admin data, because there's a lot more of this. Their self-described thing, it's very harmonized. They've got work for 13 country studies, and they do loads of stuff for every chapter, but one of the things they do is volatility. As others have pointed out, they call it income dynamics, but it's not. Footnote, to be consistent with other papers in this issue, we'll often refer to earnings as income, though the two are distinct, but they carry on anyway. Interestingly, here, on the right-hand side, here are the 13 countries with a picture of the measure of volatility on the vertical axis. Red is for men, blue is for women. And their somewhat mixed picture is essentially to say that the pictures are not all the same. And that's true. One of the things they don't really bring out in that editorial introduction is how much heterogeneity there is in volatility levels. The US, down at the bottom, 0.55, but there's quite a few above and quite a few below. Okay, so they broaden the usual country set. And the differences between the blues and the red series in some countries, in particular Norway and Sweden, is quite dramatic, to be explored some more. Very briefly, to tell you about the most recent survey stuff from the UK, which come out from our project, redoing what we did originally for the BHPS, but now including the Labour Force Survey and Understanding Society, which is the most recent, is succeeded to British Household Panel Survey. So with the two measures, but essentially, according to both of them, earnings volatility continues to be flat, and there is some decline in labor market volatility, including the zeros, and also no great recession effects that are going on. Now, I want to move into more and closely into what we're doing, which is to do with high frequency monthly volatility. We found 4 studies that have done this before, 2 for the US, 1 for the UK, 1 for Denmark. The Danish data is similar to what I'm going to tell you about for the UK. The 2 other ones are essentially drawing on bank account data, so both the first 2, a different form of administrative data, and the Ganong paper is using payroll processing data and pointing to a large amount of pay volatility. So in time remaining, I'm going to give you a quick look at pay volatility in the UK from a high frequency perspective. So the data, I have to tell you about how pay as you earn in the UK. So basically, employers must deduct from employees' pay the estimated liabilities for income tax and social insurance contributions. And of course, pass the money on to the tax authorities, who are known as His Majesty's now, Revenue and Customs, HMRC. So it basically means that in the UK, it's still the case that a majority of people, unless they're in special circumstances, don't fill in a tax return, because it's all done through PAYE over the year. This reporting system has been entirely electronic since 2014, done in real time. So the employers are submitting this stuff every payroll round, and the employers have to choose a pay frequency, weekly, monthly, or some other frequency. So what we've got in our data set is essentially a 1% sample of people in this system who were also eligible to be selected for the annual survey of hours and employment, which is based on the last 2 digits of your national insurance number, which is similar to a social security number in the US. And as I'll say later, ASH collects additional information about employers, but it's provided by employers. So the WED project got together all the PAY pay slips for 5 financial years. And this is a large amount of data. So it's about coming up to 6 million pay slips every year. And also a limitation is that we don't know about self-employed earnings, other income components, or indeed who's married to who or whatever. So it's literally about individual earnings. We treat the absence of a pay slip to mean not working, so we're just treating them as a 0. And we then focusing on 20 to 59, the most common selection in the literature, and then a few oddball observations we also throw out. So, but it still leaves us with a big data set heading towards 290,000 workers who appear at least once, and a quarter of them all of the 60 months. Onto those data, we can link one-to-one, where we can, data from ASH in 2015 to 2019. So essentially, ASH goes out, it refers to April every year, employers report. We get lots of characteristics about jobs and workers at that particular point. We link it on in every April, carry it forward for the months of the rest of the year. And we have a linked data set where we put together these two data sets. It's slightly smaller, clearly 1 year less, and we don't lose, we lose some, obviously. What's included in pay? Well, it's basically everything. It's total gross pay from all sources, multiple jobs, if they exist. But again, what we don't know, compared to, say, Ganong's paper for the US with a payroll processor, if we don't have hours, we don't have all that, the breakdown. Some of that we can get from ASH, but ASH only tells us about April. So we're looking for constructive ideas about how to use that data. A big issue is about whether or not you use the monthly or weekly reference period in deciding we're going to compare workers, some of whom are paid weekly, some of whom monthly, or some bi-weekly, or bi-monthly, or what? What are we going to do? Essentially, we end up with monthly. Monthly is more natural to people this side of the pond. Maybe everybody in the US thinks in an annual way. Okay, we're doing it monthly. And in fact, around 72% of the person months in our data of a monthly type, and around just under a quarter of the weekly type, and a few others. So basically what happens is that in this, our WED chums have put together the monthly pay slips, which monthly means monthly or some multiple of months. And they put together the weekly pay slips, so that could be weekly, 2 weekly, 4 weekly. And then basically you have to make choices about what you're going to do. So for example, if a single pay slip refers to 3 or 6 months of pay, or 2 or 4 weeks, then it's spread over the period. And then for monthly, for the weekly paid people, what we do is dailyize, so we get a daily pay rate, and then add all the daily payments together over each month. So there's a complication, at least one, so for these weekly paid people. A year, inconveniently, has got 365 or 366 days, so there's always a couple left over, 1 or 2 left over. So you have to make assumptions about where you're going to add it, and basically it's added at the end pro rata in a sensible way. But that, of course, can lead to artificial increases in pay. Artificial in the sense that that's how it is, but the second complication is that the weekly paid person whose pay is the same every week will have a derived monthly pay that varies according to the length of the month. Okay, so that can vary by about 10%, but we're going to be looking at changes that are at least a quarter. But the reality of the world is that somebody paid weekly do get paid more in March than in February. Different number of pay slips and so on. I'll come back to this issue. There are alternative approaches. We're going real. We're deflating everything by CPIH, but we can come back to that later on. So what are we going to find? So here's the distribution, the CDF. We've got big data. It's a bit difficult to summarize these sorts of things, but you can see the distribution is centered around 0. So we're distinguishing between everybody, including the zeros, or just focus on those who are not. And you can see that essentially the distribution is around 0. Skewness tells you that the number 0 at the bottom there for all working says it's basically symmetric. It's not a normal distribution. It's got much steeper shoulders than a normal distribution. And the proportions with around 0 is about 5%. If you do it in nominal, you get very similar results. I pulled out the nominal to compare it with the two US at the top and the Denmark at the bottom. And the proportion of people with 0, if you do it in nominal terms, between 1 month and the next is about the same in the US, namely 31%. Okay, now we can play with the data. So we can either look at monthly earnings a year apart or annual earnings. So now looking at our preferred measure at the moment, the mean of the ARC percentage change. It's this measure of volatility from 1 month to the next. Down the bottom is 1 year to the next. Low number, right? Flat. You do it for month. So you're looking at, for example, April 2015 to the April next year, March, then you go forward to May and do it again. And you can see it's hugely greater, and we're seeing a seasonal blip arrive. Okay, so the reference period matters. So you do things annually in volatility, you lose a lot of volatility. Now look at this one. So we now move monthly earnings month to month. So again, this is at the top, this is labor market volatility, including the zeros, movements in and out, and we've got positive earnings in the red line below. Importantly for later, all the charts are going to have the same format. The long dashes are picking out Aprils, and the short dashes, vertical lines, are picking out Novembers. And if you take one thing away from this talk, take it away that there is a lot of volatility within a year, and marked pattern, right? Things happen. What do we know about April? April is the beginning of the new financial year. Okay? So things are happening around March and April. And you can see that basically the pattern for both labor market volatility and earnings volatility is much the same. So I'm pretty much going to focus on the red so far and more breakdowns. This slide basically is just to back up my earlier point that which index you choose doesn't matter. So the red line is the one I've just talked about. The blue line is the standard deviation of the ARC percentage change, and the standard deviation of the change of logs at the top. It's just shifting up and down. What about men and women? Well, the top one is labor market volatility. The bottom one is earnings volatility. And you can see that it's basically the same for men and women, in particular if you focus on those who are earning last period and this period. There's a slight difference in the middle around about September for women moving in and out of the labor force. That has an effect. Now I'm going to show you a range of slides fairly quickly, just the breakdowns of how these things work. So there are, in terms of the weekly paid and the monthly paid pay slips groups that we were talking about before, big difference. You can see that weekly paid people have got higher volatility than the monthly paid people, and the seasonal pattern is slightly different. If you look at the poorest paid people, the poorest fifth in particular, compared to the other fifths in the distribution, the red line at the top is tracking out volatility for the poorest fifths at T-1. And you can see that that's vastly greater than the next three quintile groups up. But look at also the interesting pattern for the richest paid fifths at the time, very, very seasonal. So it's not only at the bottom, but also the top. It varies by age. So we basically go from the young, the 20 to 25s at the top, the red, through to the old and cold blue at the bottom. And you can see as you move down, this correlated with age. Similar seasonal patterns once you get to those groups, but for the 20 to 25-year-olds, much higher volatility, different seasonal pattern. If you've got multiple jobs at this time, you've got volatility is much higher. If you look by low pay sectors, you get spaghetti. Okay, so what we've done here is that the Low Pay Commission identifies 14 low pay sectors. And I've shown pictures here for 7 of them. and compared them with people who are not in a low-paid sector. The bottom red line is that group, which is basically the sort of picture we've seen before. And then you can see that there's a huge variation. Again, it's picking up this point that the people who are low paid or doing a low paid job have got much higher volatility. So the ones at the top are hospitality, social care, and retail. And there's also differences in terms of the size of the fluctuations, the amplitude. So textiles, for example, and retail have got huge, big jumps up and down. Those on temporary contracts have got much higher volatility and a different pattern. Those who are hourly paid, slightly more, and differences between private and public sector. Public sector workers, relatively flat, bumping around, but look what's happening in the private sector. So around 1/5 of our observations are in the public sector. So you basically got the message: low paid sector, private sector jobs, weekly pay slips and hourly paid, young, multiple jobs, temporary contracts. And there's also this thing about huge seasonality in there. And you might wonder whether or not high volatility is being driven by large falls or large rises. And we think you should look at the two together, particularly what's happening around April period and whether or not they're having independent effects. So here's looking at the probability of the fractions of people with a rise of at least 25% in red, and the probability for fall of at least 25% in blue. And you can see that the red peaks essentially at the end of the financial year, March, and also in December around Christmas. And the falls are greatest in April and January. So there are differences in this, and we would like to explore that further. We've done some regression analysis, but I'm going to skip that because basically it tells the same story as those univariate breakdowns that I've been showing you. I'm not going to tell you about multi-period stuff, if only because we haven't done much about it. Well, I want to finish with telling you about policy responses to volatility and why the volatility that I've showed you is really important in the UK. Basically, if you've got the state going to intervene, what it would like to do is tighten the income bungee's elastic, stop it, not going down so far, cushion those large falls, while of course maintaining work incentives, getting people to self-insure, broadly speaking. In the past, the tax credit system in the UK made the same payment to each eligible family regularly throughout the year, but there was an annual reckoning up with possible clawbacks of payments. So it's a bit like US EITC in that sense. We're now in a world of universal credit, which is the principal form of state cash support for working age families, whether in work or out of work. And I want to emphasize the bit about in work because of around 40% of claimants at the moment, 38%, according to the last month's data, are in families in paid work. Okay, so this is really important. Well, the universal credit assessment period is 1 month, with 1 monthly reckoning up, including possible clawbacks of past overpayments on a month-by-month basis. And what do they use as information about people's earnings? Those RTI data I've been showing you. Okay, and of course it depends not only on those, but changes in other things like household composition and so on. So this can be a really good thing. For example, during COVID, universal credit people got money really fast. But there are problems. Weekly pay people, for example, if you're one weekly paid, paid every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, you get different numbers of pay packets across the year, depending on what the months. So you can have months with an unusually high monthly pay, even if you've actually got the same amount in your weekly pay packet. And it can lead to downward adjustments in your next universal UC amount received. And if you've got volatility, it's even more compounded. And this, of course, can cause problems. And monthly people, not just the weekly people, have got alignment issues as well, because the assessment period for universal credit is not aligned with the monthly period corresponding to your pay dates. It's determined, your assessment period for UC is determined by the day on which you first apply for universal credit. So you can construct examples, and the slide is essentially about an example of borrowed from Dan Tomlinson's work, just to show that basically because of the way in which the system works, the adjustments are made with quite some lag, and it's also possible to construct examples to show that fluctuations in pay can be amplified by universal credit. So volatility of the combined income can in fact be greater than volatility of pay alone. So basically we see this gains in responsiveness being, which is a good thing, but offset by potential problems of misalignment of reference periods across the income sources. Of course, the payment levels are also important, and we've heard in the papers today about what's been going on in the UK. Basically, if you haven't got much money, then it's pretty hard to manage this uncertainty through all sorts of budgeting and planning and borrowing and saving and that sort of thing. Of course, it's not only what people do, it's what employers do. Things can be worse because of unintended adverse effects of backdated pay increases, performance bonuses, late filing, corrections of initial filings, and so on. And there are also interactions with other things because of, for example, if you've got kids and you can get support through universal credit, but fees may have to be paid up in advance. So there's this mismatch in needs and payments. So we're almost at the end, and I just sort of remind you that there's this interpretation issue. What I've been showing you is what's out there, the actual changes. We haven't said this is what people want or whether they don't want. And I've got a long quotation there from Shin and Solon, which is about whether or not, how we interpret this, and actually identifying genuine risk that really matters for these sorts of people separately from things that they choose in their life. And that's important, right? But I would like to suggest that that's a bit of a cop-out in the sense that we've got lots of information already. We know, for example, from the smaller scale family finances studies that the importance of income regularity and certainty is really important for low-income families. So my conclusions, well, you've seen these conclusions, these four already, because I showed them to you before at the beginning. Hope you remembered. But I just want to give a second set of conclusions to ask you is about, I bet this doesn't occur only in the UK. So how do other countries deal with volatility and alignment across different domains and countries? Think about the US, where everything's reckoned up at the end of the year, even the ITC. I bet you things happen during the year, right? So importantly, there are things to do about, in terms of getting more information about this. As I said at the beginning, the importance about income is that we need to put together lots of different income sources, not only about labor incomes. There's other stuff going on within the household. We've got to think, in particular, the interactions with social support systems. Okay, so those are issues. How do we look at them? Well, we've seen that administrative data are really cool. You can do lots of stuff. They're very powerful, but they're also limited because we don't know a lot about what's going on beyond what the system was designed to do, which was not this sort of research. So household survey data, longitudinal data are going to remain valuable. They're potentially problematic because of sample sizes, measurement error, etc. But they've got the additional information. So we need to somehow put everything together, and those small-scale family finances studies are also valuable. So very much welcome any questions and comments. We've got stuff to do, but for now, that's it. Thank you. No, whatever you like.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that very interesting and very comprehensive exploration of this issue about what we know about income volatility. We have some time for questions before dinner, so who would like to ask?
They passed the microphone over here.
Oh.
Stephen, you've got at least 3 or 4 papers here. The whole ash thing is a whole...
It's Timmy's over there.
Oh.
the whole ash thing, the whole new series is very interesting because it talks about, things that I would call voluntary, meaning you took this job and they're baked into the job, right? Things are baked into the job. Now, the most important thing for those who teach labor economics is to understand that college professors have no variance in their earnings, and most people work for governments, the same thing. So you have to look at, you're not looking at your own world. You're not used to the world where, gee, are we going to, is income going to go up or down? The welfare implications, I think, are really important. People who look at losses versus gains, losses seem to be more important. Compensation for losses. Voluntary changes. I work less because I went to school, or having a child, and so forth. Those can involve intra-household reallocation of resources too. But so I'm trying to think about the big picture. Oh, by the way, the lovely thing about the Morduk one, which is a very under financial diaries, that's monthly within years. That is a monthly within years.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's why I cited it, Tim. So is John Hill's study, which was done much earlier.
Really?
Yeah, 2006.
He did one in a developing country first. But anyway, those are really important because you see within month to month. So then the idea is, can you smooth? Does the government help you smooth? You have savings. You have access to credit, which are all really important mechanisms for smoothing the volatility. I think this is a fantastic, there's tons of material here, Stephen. And I'm having you pull together, this is a whole new book or a whole new paper. And I find it very interesting too. But thank you very much. A lot to think of and way beyond Gottschalk and Moffat and way beyond lots of other people. Really appreciate the talk.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree, Tim. That, as I gave, the slide, the quotation from Shin and Solon, which is pointing out the standard problem about what's voluntary, what's not. But you also talked about, you said something like choosing a job or more hours or less hours. Short term, having a kid, short term versus long term. To what extent do you choose if you're on a 0 hours contract and the employer says you've got to come in tomorrow? Are you choosing it or not? Some people might not, it's really hard. But it's important, I think, to set out what's actually happening before, speculation. The stuff in ASH, just by the way, we will provide clues because there's more detailed information that we have in the April survey about some of this stuff. But the problem is putting the ASH stuff together with the HMRC stuff, which is the truth. Insofar as the world says, well, and certainly from the point of view of the universal credit assessment, it is the truth, regardless of whether or not it was wrong at the time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah. Thank you. Great presentation, Stephen. As expected, I should add. I've two more technical questions. One is about you refer to income from labor for self-employed. I wondered how you define it, because we often refer to that as mixed income, because it has two components. It has a compensation for labor input, and it's kind of a profit for the unincorporated enterprise. I was wondering how that was defined, but perhaps you can skip that question if you want. The other one is, you didn't say anything at all about negative income.
Yeah.
And I come originally from a rural area. I know that in agriculture you can have very, very negative income, high volatility of income. Didn't hear you about it. But perhaps more importantly, and this related to what Tim said, when I look at your own project on labor income, you already said that you didn't take into account social benefits, but my question about this monthly volatility, some of that volatility is simply expected. If I look at the Dutch situation, everybody knows when you get your monthly pay, and also civil servants, in May, you get an extra month of bonus for vacation. You know when you get your pay in December, you will have the 13th month, or some have the 14th month. This I consider, well, it may be problematic for some households, but for most households this is completely expected and they deal with it. And I would call it this simple seasonal patterns. But sure. I want to know what happens outside the seasonal patterns.
So do we. And what counts as predictable. This is what I mean about going inside these these things. I mean, we don't, as far as I know, Britain doesn't have this European type thing of 13th month pay, so that doesn't exist in the same way. But certainly people not too far away, a mile to the east, will be getting big bonuses and things, and that'll show up, you know, maybe at the end of the financial year, at different parts of the year. And of course that leads to a large fall the next month. But, you know, so some of the volatility is in there, but you know, you need to see it and to be able to describe it and to be able to talk about it. Negative incomes, Mike may help me out here, but I don't think there are many in there at all. I mean, we're talking about labor earnings, and that's also important for your question about self-employment. The short answer to your question is this is earnings that went through the PAYE system. So if part of the person's compensation was their employer, even if that was them, put it through PAYE, it's in there. But as I said, we don't have everything. They may be paying themselves some other stuff through some vehicle, but we don't have that. Only through PAYE.
PA.
YE, pay as you earn.
Yeah, but that's not income tax.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
That's what I explained. So the UK system may be odd compared to other parts of the world, but it started with this idea is that everything accumulates over the year so that most people, by the end of the year, owe nothing because they've already paid it. The employer's paid it on their behalf by I think it's called withholding elsewhere.
I was referring to agriculture, and you have
Well, then, unless
prices, and they won't have.
Well, if they work for a farmer, if they're the tractor driver for the landlord, the person who owns the farm, and are paid, they're in one of those low-pay sectors. You probably didn't see agriculture there very well.
In this project, you don't include self-employed.
No, not at all. Not at all. So I rushed past some of those bits.
Paul Schreier, I just wanted to follow up on something that was briefly mentioned, that is basically moving from considering disposable income to moving adjusted disposable income, so including social transfers in kind. I mean, those are big items: health, education, housing, services, which even if you don't have the data, I would suspect would reduce volatility by quite a bit. Probably along similar lines, one could argue if you wouldn't want to bring in things like own-occupied housing, which is an implicit income component that may reduce the volatility of the upper echelons again. And so some of these more implicit or imputed income components that didn't make it into your study at all for data reasons, but I'd also like your take on it in terms of the concepts.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the reason I was showing you output from, for example, Karen and Dinan's and others' work, and Mike Brewer and others' work, was precisely because of that, is that you put stuff together and it reduces the risk of the overall household income package. Owner-occupied housing, imputed rent and all that sort of stuff, yeah, you could include those sorts of things, but as people always say, you can't eat your house. We're talking about, it's not money in people's pockets, and we're in short periods of time, we're talking about really important things. So it comes back to almost, social judgment about what the appropriate assessment come reference period is over which time people are assumed to be able to smooth their incomes. And clearly, it's my remark about the US is that it's a year. For example, as represented by institutions. I asked my summer school students over the summer, half of whom from the US, and I asked all of them what was the appropriate reference for. They all come up with year. They just, whereas this side of the pond it's a bit different, I suspect. But there is a real problem for the stick components and imputed rental income about you can't cash them up. So it's Marshall, yeah.
Excellent presentation. So I'm just wondering about institutions. In the U.S., hourly pay is pretty common, and there's lots of people who get a significant amount from overtime. You get time and a half after 40 hours and double time after 60 hours. And the other question I have on institutions is how common in the UK are jobs where you get significant bonuses or a bonus is I understand the city, those guys, sure, they live off of bonuses, but I have a feeling it's more common in the US than maybe the UK.
I'm pretty ignorant about that, to be honest. But I would have thought if you change it to the word commission, okay, so people have a basic plus commission, I would expect it would be more common. There are, yeah, I mean, I don't know about the US proportion, but in our sample, around 40% of the observations, I seem to recall, were hourly paid. So part of the variation that we'll be seeing there is people varying their hours and even moving in and out of work. So one good explanation, for example, of the difference between, for women, of the labour market volatility and the earnings volatility is that there was this September peak. You know, there are quite a few women who do not, who take time out during the school holidays, which finish at the end of August. So, that's possibly voluntary, or is it not? Because there's nobody else to look after the kids. So, yeah, I mean, so what we would like to know, of course, is, and Ganong, for example, for the US work, has got the access to this payroll processor stuff. And in that data, he's got that breakdown. He's got total and essentially breaks. We don't have that. Ash has some of that, but it doesn't align exactly with what we've got. So we've got to think in a magic way about how to draw out these sorts of things. So that's an ongoing agenda item, stuff to do. No, he wasn't first. Arthur was first.
Sorry, Arthur.
Stephen, thanks for that. How does this tie in, or have you tied it into the wage rigidity literature, which looks at almost all of these things, but in the opposite way? So when it comes to things like bonuses and things like that, they'll say, okay, we'll strip out bonuses and you've still got rigid wages, or we'll strip out seasonal work and we've still got rigid wages, or whatever like that. Have you gone through a checklist of all the stuff that wage rigidity people look at to see that you're looking at the same things? And also, with that one of the big things, of course, is when people change jobs. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, what the downwardly rigid wage people look at, they try and get as clean as possible. So it's basically they end up looking at, if they look at total earnings, then they might whittle it down to basic pay, for example. And of course, they look at nominal, because they're often interested in its nominal rigidity. Well, as I've already said, we can't distinguish between total earnings and basic pay except during the ASH. And all the studies that have been done for the UK have been done using the ASH data. In fact, there are arguments that those people have, by Gary Solon and some others, and somebody else whose name has just escaped my mind, uses ASH on the argument that the employer-reported data are more accurate than the survey data of where the earlier studies have done. And there is quite a lot of downward wage rigidity, but there are tails. So basically, here, even in terms of total earnings, we've got heading up to almost a third of people in terms of nominal who have got the same this month and last month.
And have you divided up between salary earners and non-salary earners? Do you have that information?
No, we've got monthly paid, essentially those who are on a monthly schedule, or 2 monthly, or a weekly schedule, which is either every week, every fortnight, every 4 weeks. So that's all we can do. And I've showed you those pictures. So yeah, you could produce this sort of picture for those different groups. Yeah, as Tim said, we've got a load of papers we can write, but there's also the limit that always we can't break it down.
Thank you. Stephen, 2 quick questions. The very first one is related to what was just asked. Can you separate, when you measure earnings volatility for people staying in the same job from earnings volatility due to the fact that people change job, so change employer?
Well, as we can do the zeros, we can do the positives to the zeros and the zeros up. We have some information about changes of job, don't we, Mike? Some, but again, we'll have more about that for, I mean, the ASH stuff, but again, it doesn't quite match up. But it's really quite, you saw, I went past it rather fast, but in terms of converting the pay slip information to the earnings information is quite a process, which our WED colleagues did quite a lot of the hard work. But along there is information about, we've got a variable, things like whether or not somebody is in the same job all the year, I seem to recall. Have we, Mike? Something like that, or in the same job last year. So there is limited, we can do something about.
I would expect different patterns, I mean, among people changing job during the year. That is a changing employer.
Yeah.
That is the second point is just a clarification. I remember in your past talks about spaghetti and so on, you emphasized a lot the issue of measurement error. You excluded that there is measurement error in this data?
No, in fact, I've referred to it twice at least. In particular, the one is employers can make mistakes. Okay, so when they put things up, either because they've got crappy software or because they're just data entry or mismeasured. So, but that also that leads to the second point, is that those data that they've uploaded are the truth as far as the benefits agency are concerned, because those are what they've got on their system. Now they can be fixed. That's what I'm saying. They can be, the employers can correct them, but then that also has consequences for workers. So there can be screwy observations, but at least compared to surveys, in terms of the way economists usually think about measurement error, compared to Ganong and the other, our data are much more like the Danish system, in the sense that's also like Social Security agency earnings records, but somehow they're monthly in Denmark. I don't know if everybody gets paid monthly in Denmark. Drew Dahl and his mates never say in their paper anything about that. But yeah, these are essentially the truth. And they're a large sample, and it's a random sample, unlike the Ganong stuff, where he pedals rather fast to say that his pay processor data from one particular pay processor is representative, even though it's mostly from not large firms. All right, dinner time.
All right. I really want to. I think you're all getting very hungry, and that was certainly a very stimulating discussion to stimulate our appetites. I really want to thank Stephen from the bottom of my heart for accepting to do this. I know personally I learned so much from all of this exchange, and you sharing all your insights and experience with us. And this has been a really great end to a very successful first day of the conference. Thanks a lot for the support from ESCO and everyone, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow morning.